What if the war that changes everything had already started, and most people had no idea it was even happening? Right now, as you read headlines about missile strikes and energy prices, the real story goes much deeper than anything you're seeing on the evening news. There are calculations being made in war rooms, in religious councils, and in nuclear-armed capitals that will determine whether the next few weeks end in a ceasefire or in something that dwarfs every conflict since World War II. By the time this video is over, you'll understand exactly why some of the most powerful people on Earth aren't trying to stop this war. They're trying to make it worse. It started on February 28, 2026, just before dawn. The joint U.S.-Israeli campaign, launched under the operational names Roaring Lion and Epic Fury, wasn't a warning shot. It was a decapitation strike. Within hours of the first wave of missiles hitting Iran, the Islamic Republic's supreme leader, the man who had held absolute authority over a nation of 90 million people for decades, was dead, assassinated, not captured, not exiled, not humiliated at a negotiating table, dead. The shockwave hit financial markets before the sun had even risen over Europe. Oil futures spiked, currency markets froze, defense stocks surged, and in the halls of power from Washington to Beijing, phones started ringing, because every serious military planner knew what this meant. This was not a limited strike. This was not a pressure campaign. This was the opening move of a war designed to end Iran as a functioning military power, and possibly as a functioning state. Within the first 24 hours, the Israeli Air Force struck more than 200 targets across western and central Iran, command centers, IRGC compounds, missile systems, naval assets on the Caspian Sea, and strategic gas fields in the south. Over 150 hacktivist cyber attacks were recorded simultaneously, crashing Iranian internet infrastructure and leaving the country in near total digital blackout. Iran found itself fighting on every front at once, in the sky, on the ground, in cyberspace, and against a global propaganda war it had no tools left to counter. Say the word Qatar, and most people think of soccer or luxury airlines. But there is one number that intelligence analysts have been obsessing over for years, 20%. Qatar provides roughly 20% of the entire world's liquefied natural gas. 1 out of every 5 homes heated by gas in Europe. 1 out of every 5 factories powered by LNG in Asia. 20%. That single tiny peninsula in the Persian Gulf is a load-bearing wall in the architecture of the global economy. Iran knew exactly what it was doing when it targeted Ras Laffan Industrial City. Ras Laffan is the largest LNG export facility on Earth, a sprawling industrial complex along Qatar's northeastern coastline that handles an almost incomprehensible volume of energy exports every single day. When Iranian missiles and drones hit it, Qatar Energy confirmed publicly that 17% of Qatar's total LNG export capacity had been knocked out, not damaged. Knocked out. And the chief executive of Qatar Energy warned that the damage could take up to 5 years to fully repair. The attacks didn't stop at Qatar. A barrage of Iranian missiles and drones hit energy facilities in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Bahrain. All of them American allies, all of them hosting U.S. military installations. At least 6 people were killed and over 100 injured, many of them migrant workers who had no part in any geopolitical calculation. The message Iran was sending was unmistakable. Reports suggest the strategy wasn't random. It was Tehran executing a deliberate plan to hold Gulf energy infrastructure hostage, forcing Washington's regional allies to pressure the U.S. and Israel to back down. But the plan had a dark flip side, because every barrel of oil removed from global supply would eventually be felt by ordinary people thousands of miles from any battlefield. While the world was watching Qatar's energy sector burn, something was happening over Tel Aviv that the Israeli government was working hard to keep off your screen. Iran launched repeated missile barrages at Israel's most populated city, but these weren't the same missiles that had been intercepted by Iron Dome in years past. According to reports from multiple Israeli defense analysts, the new salvos included cluster warheads, a weapon that fundamentally changes the math of air defense. Here's why that matters. Iron Dome was engineered to intercept individual missiles. One projectile, one intercept. A cluster warhead doesn't work that way. It breaks apart at altitude and releases dozens of submunitions that fan out across a wide area simultaneously. You're not stopping a single bullet. You're trying to stop a shotgun blast with one hand. The system wasn't designed for this, and the results showed. Residential buildings were hit. Emergency services were stretched beyond capacity. A population that had spent years trusting in an invisible technological shield was suddenly discovering that no shield is impenetrable. The Israeli government imposed strict broadcast restrictions on footage coming out of Tel Aviv. 3 weeks into the war, as Iran and Hezbollah continued launching heavy barrages across Israel, reports confirmed that a ballistic missile fragment had landed near the Western Wall and Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, one of the most symbolically charged locations on the planet. The psychological impact was devastating, not just tactically, but in a deeper, harder-to-measure way. This was a war that had arrived inside Israel's most sacred geography. And yet, You'd think this level of destruction would make Israeli leadership desperate for an exit ramp. You'd think the combination of burning cities and a fragile public would force pragmatism. You'd be wrong. Because to understand why peace isn't being pursued, you have to understand something that most Western analysts either dismiss or completely ignore. The word is eschatology. It's the study of end times, the religious and theological frameworks around how the world concludes. And right now, inside the most influential religious circles in Israel, there are people who are not mourning the destruction raining down on their country. They're treating it as confirmation. Reports suggest that certain prominent rabbis in Jerusalem have been preaching openly that the chaos unfolding across the Middle East is a necessary prelude to the coming of the Messiah. The more extreme voices have gone so far as to frame each missile strike, each escalation, each widening of the conflict as a divine signal that the end times are near. These aren't fringe voices muttering in obscure synagogues. These are figures with documented political access, rabbis whose words reach lawmakers, whose endorsements shape coalition politics, and whose theological framing influences the way Israeli decision-makers understand the conflict they're in. When you understand this dimension, a lot of otherwise baffling decisions start to make sense. Why isn't Israel pursuing a ceasefire when its largest city is taking direct hits? Why do the stated objectives keep expanding? First neutralize the nuclear program, then topple the government, then fragment the country, rather than settling at any achievable stopping point. The answer isn't purely strategic. For some of the key players in this conflict, the goal was never security. The goal was finality. And finality, in this framework, looks a lot like total war. But here's what this religious dimension connects to, and this is something that goes largely unreported. It connects directly to what Israel and America are actually trying to do to Iran as a country. There are two ways to defeat an enemy. You can defeat them militarily, force them to surrender by overwhelming their armed forces, or you can destroy them structurally, collapse their economy, fracture their society, and leave them too internally divided to ever threaten you again. The second approach is what military strategists call Balkanization, named after the process that tore Yugoslavia apart in the 1990s and left the region fragmented into a collection of smaller, weaker states that spent the following decades fighting one another instead of projecting regional power. Iran is not a homogeneous country. It never has been. Beneath the surface of the Islamic Republic is a complex mosaic. Persians, Azeris, Kurds, Arabs in the southwest, Baloch in the southeast. Dozens of ethnic and linguistic communities with distinct identities, distinct grievances, and in many cases, distinct histories of friction with the Persian-dominated central government. For decades, foreign intelligence agencies have studied these fault lines and occasionally poked at them. What's reportedly happening now is far more systematic. The goal, according to multiple analyst frameworks, is to fund separatist movements, arm minority groups, and provoke enough internal conflict that Iran can never reconstitute itself as a regional power. The ACL-led conflict monitoring group documented that U.S.-Israel strikes have hit targets in at least 26 of Iran's 31 provinces. Government compounds, IRGC bases, the National Broadcasting Agency, and notably detention facilities that reportedly resulted in jailbreaks in Kurdish border regions. The IRGC ordered the evacuation of one border city, suggesting preparations for a possible ground confrontation. This isn't the pattern of a campaign trying to force a ceasefire. This is the pattern of a campaign trying to hollow a country out from the inside. And at the center of all of it, literally, geographically, economically, sits a small island most people have never heard of. 30 kilometers off the Iranian coastline in the northern Persian Gulf sits a piece of land that might be the single most strategically important piece of real estate in the world right now. Karg Island. It doesn't look like much on a map, but Karg handles somewhere between 90 and 95% of Iran's crude oil exports, about 1.7 million barrels per day, connected by pipelines directly to Iran's major onshore oil fields, and equipped with deep-water terminals capable of loading the world's largest tankers. If you want to strangle the Iranian economy overnight, you take Karg Island. As of the third week of March 2026, reports indicate that thousands of U.S. Marines are moving toward the Persian Gulf. Iran responded by rapidly militarizing the island, deploying additional troops, laying mines along sections of the coastline, and reinforcing air defense systems in apparent preparation for an amphibious assault. Axios reported that the U.S. government had actively considered seizing the island, and J.P. Morgan released a detailed note warning that if Karg were captured, Iran's oil exports would effectively halt, and production could be cut in half, triggering a retaliatory escalation against regional energy infrastructure that would make the Qatar strikes look minor. The strategic logic behind taking Karg is simple enough. No oil exports, no revenue, no ability to sustain a war. On paper, a combined amphibious and airborne assault could secure the island relatively quickly, but holding it is a different calculation entirely. Karg sits within range of Iranian coastal artillery, anti-ship missiles, and a mainland that can be resupplied far faster than any occupying force can be reinforced. The U.S. military's own analysts have drawn uncomfortable comparisons to prior limited objective missions that metastasized into decade-long commitments. Take the island, and you have to defend the coastline. Defend the coastline, and you have to push inland. Push inland, and you're in the Zagros Mountains, terrain that has stopped invaders for 3,000 years. But the Karg scenario isn't even the most terrifying escalation pathway. Not by a long shot. On September 18, 2025, 5 months before this war began, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan signed something called the Strategic Mutual Defense Agreement. The text of the agreement is carefully worded. It doesn't explicitly mention nuclear weapons, but the way Pakistani officials described it publicly left very little ambiguity. Pakistan committed to extending its nuclear deterrent to Saudi Arabia. Any attack on one country would be treated as an attack on both. When Iran began striking Saudi energy infrastructure in early March 2026, Pakistan's Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar held a press conference in Islamabad. His message to Tehran was direct. I informed the Iranian side about our defense agreement. The implicit warning was unmistakable. Push Saudi Arabia far enough, and a nuclear-armed nation enters the equation. Iran's response, according to reports, was to suggest that Saudi Arabia should ensure its territory isn't being used to facilitate U.S.-Israeli operations. In other words, we know the pact exists, and we're warning you not to test it. Now look at a map. Pakistan shares a long, complex border with Iran to the east. If Saudi Arabia were formally drawn into direct hostilities and Pakistan honored its defense pact, Iran would find itself fighting a two-front war, U.S. and Israeli forces pressing from the west, Pakistani forces from the east. The military term for this is a pincer movement, and historically, armies caught in a pincer don't survive intact. The escalation scenario that keeps defense analysts awake at night isn't just nuclear weapons being available. It's nuclear weapons being available to parties who are already in an active shooting war. Once that threshold is crossed, you're no longer talking about conventional deterrence. You're talking about a situation where desperate actors face impossible calculations. Every map of global trade has two pinch points that planners have historically described as civilization's vulnerabilities. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow passage connecting the Persian Gulf to the wider ocean, and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the southern gateway between the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. Through the Strait of Hormuz flows roughly 20% of the world's oil supply. Through Bab el-Mandeb passes approximately 12% of global trade, funneled through the Suez Canal. In the entire history of modern global commerce, both straits have never been simultaneously threatened. On February 28, 2026, and the same day the U.S.-Israel strikes began, Iran moved to effectively close the Strait of Hormuz. About 20,000 seafarers are currently stranded at sea as the virtual shutdown of that passage continues. Simultaneously, on March 12th, Houthi leader Abdul Malik al-Houthi, whose forces have been formally rearmed and reactivated following the broader regional escalation, declared his group's hands were on the trigger regarding the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Iranian military officials stated publicly that Iran has both the will and the ability to create a completely credible threat against Bab el-Mandeb. Major shipping lines didn't wait around to find out if the threat was real. Maersk, Hapag-Lloyd, and CMA-CGM, three of the world's largest container carriers, suspended all trans-Suez sailings and rerouted ships around the Cape of Good Hope as of early March. That adds 10 to 14 days per voyage and hundreds of thousands of dollars in additional costs per transit. Now multiply that across every container ship that would normally pass through those routes. Every electronics shipment, every pharmaceutical delivery, every automotive component, and you start to understand what supply chain collapse actually looks like in practice. South Korea and Japan, both almost entirely dependent on Persian Gulf energy imports, face economic catastrophe within weeks if these closures persist. They won't be watching from the sidelines much longer. Iran's command structure has been systematically targeted since day one. The joint campaign has killed Khamenei, eliminated dozens of IRGC senior commanders, bombed the presidential office, and struck the Expediency Council. Each targeted killing removes one more person who might have had both the access and the disposition to explore an exit ramp. The individuals who rise to fill those vacuums during wartime are rarely the pragmatists. They are the hardliners, the true believers, the people for whom surrender represents something worse than continued destruction. By eliminating every figure capable of brokering a compromise, the campaign has ensured that whoever speaks for Iran next will be less willing to negotiate than whoever spoke for Iran before. On the Israeli and American side, the stated objectives keep expanding. What began as neutralizing Iran's nuclear program has evolved into toppling the government, which has evolved into fragmenting the country along ethnic lines. There is no defined endpoint, no clear line that, once crossed, would allow either party to declare victory and stop. Reports suggest that Netanyahu, 3 weeks into the war, claimed significant progress. but signaled explicitly that more is to come. Two parties with maximalist goals, no shared vision of what done looks like, and a systematic elimination of anyone pragmatic enough to find a middle ground. This is how wars become generational. 4 things will tell you everything you need to know about where this goes next. First, watch Karg Island. If U.S. Marines attempt an amphibious landing, it signals that the campaign has entered a new, irreversible phase, one with no clean exit and every risk of the mission creep that has defined American military involvement from Vietnam to Afghanistan. Second, watch Saudi Arabia's formal posture. If Riyadh officially declares war on Iran, the Pakistan Defense Pact activates, and nuclear deterrence stops being theoretical. Third, watch the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. If the Houthis formally close it alongside the Strait of Hormuz, the global economy faces a supply shock that no central bank can print its way out of. Food prices, fuel prices, and the basic cost of living will spike in places that have no direct connection to this conflict. Nations that import nearly all their energy, Japan, South Korea, much of Europe, will face a political crisis that forces their hands militarily. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, watch for any signal, however small, of back-channel communication between the parties. A leaked diplomatic contact, a neutral country offering mediation, a humanitarian corridor deal. In the history of modern warfare, the end almost always begins with something quiet, something most people miss. Because right now, the religious zealots in this conflict see escalation as prophecy being fulfilled. The strategic planners on both sides see it as an opportunity to resolve decades of unfinished business. The Iranians, backed into a corner with their economy bleeding and their leadership decimated, are executing a strategy of mutual destruction. If we fall, we're taking the global energy supply with us. Nobody in any of those rooms is looking for the door, but history isn't predetermined. Somewhere in this chaos, there is still the possibility of a different choice. Whether anyone powerful enough to make that choice is still alive, still in position, and still willing, that's the question that will define the next chapter of this story. And the answer is coming faster than most people realize.